So welcome everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to present to you in this webinar the 7th paper issued from the IAA Climate Risk Task Force. This is a paper that has been developing jointly with the ISA Technical Commission, and I hope that you will enjoy the paper as much as we did when we wrote it. My name is Barbara D'Ambrogiola, and I represent the IAA. I will be the moderator of this webinar, and I've been the lead author of this paper. I have been working in pension and social security for the last 20 years, and I moved 1 year ago to life insurance. The second speaker, it's a great pleasure to have here ISA Secretary General Marcelo Abirramia-Caetano, and he is the Secretary General of the International Social Security Association. He was elected in December 2018. He has also been serving as Secretary for Social Security of Brazil. And between 1998 and 2005, he has been the coordinator for actuary of the Ministry of Security in Brazil. Then we have 3 more authors that will present in this webinar, and in order will be Michelle Dong. She is an actuary working in life insurance and sustainable finance, and she is currently based in the UK. She is completing her PhD at the Australian National University on actuarial studies and climate modeling. The next speaker will be then Jackie Ruan. She is also co-author, and she is an actuary at the Office of the Chief Actuary. She has been also working in actuarial consultation for financial institution and captive insurance. And then we have Asya Billing. She is the Chief Actuary of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institution in Canada. And she's also the chair of the Technical Commission on Statistical, Actuarial, and Financial Studies of the International Social Security Association. So I'm happy to welcome all of you. And if we go to the next slide, we have few housekeeping before that we begin. So question and comments, you have a button somewhere on your screen, in the bottom or on the top of it, where is written Q&A. Please just post your question there. And a YouTube record will be made and will be available after this webinar. And few disclaimer. We are authors of the paper. Our remarks today are our personal opinions, and they are not official position of the IAA or ISA. And now it's with a great pleasure that I leave the floor to Marcelo Abirramia-Caetano. Please.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and the pleasure is all mine for this. I'm really pleased with the collaboration that we are establishing, the ISA and the International Actuarial Association, and it shows how can we be, this sort of collaboration can be useful to our membership. We see in ISA, we have as members the social security institutions that implement the social security policy all over the world, and how this topic of climate change is relevant to them. It is being inserted in the agenda in many different areas, And we see now this reflection in the actuarial world as well. I myself, I come from the actuarial world as well. I don't work with actuary for a long time, but I came in. And 20 years ago, when I started, 20, 25 years ago, when I worked with it, climate change was something that should not be, we were not relating to climate change to actuary. And now we see how this thing is in the agenda. It's the seventh work that you are developing. So it's a great pleasure to me that we see that this collaboration is feasible for us to develop quite interesting things to both communities, the actuarial community and to the community of social security institutions. So I close by thank you, Barbara, very much. I'd really like to thank and congratulate all the writers, so Jack, Michelle, Asia, and my personal and special thanks to Asia Bilic, who wrote, who signed with me in last year, I think so, in Mexico, the MOU, the continuation of the MOU with our both institutions. So this shows how this collaboration can be fruitful to all of us and also to the ASIA work related to the chair now of the ISA Technical Commission on the Statistical, Actuarial, and Financial Institutes. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased with this collaboration that shows how working together we can construct very interesting things to our membership, even the number of people attending this webinar, more than 100 people attending this webinar. So they show how relevant we can be to everybody. So thank you very much to everybody. Unfortunately, I have to leave now. Barbara, I give the floor back to you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you a lot, Gaetano, and welcome back to everyone else. It has been a pleasure on my side to work with ISA, and I hope that this collaboration will just last long. So I would like to open to you a bit to tell something about what is the CRTF and why this paper was written. The CRTF, it's a climate-related risk task force, and it has been a task force time limited, so it has been lasting few years. And the idea when it was created was to produce relevant material to all the stakeholders related to climate change related risk. And of course, being a task force of the IIA, one of the tasks was adding value to the IIA members, but also be actuarial, be on the wave. The task force has been excellently led by Micheline Dion and Gabor Hanak, and it has been really a great pleasure and a great trip to see with them and study the climate-related risk from so many different points of view. In the next slide, we see that the CRTF has been really active, and actually there are this social security related paper is the last one of a series. The first one was issued in 2020, and it was an introduction paper on the importance of the climate risk related for actuaries. And then in 21 February, it has been issued a paper on the climate related scenarios. And then we have in 21 one paper on the application of these scenarios to insurance and other financial institution. And then we have a really important paper in 2022. We will refer to it also in our paper. And these are climate-related risk scenarios to asset portfolios. After that, there are a few more papers, and the one was related to standards. and disclosure and risk management, and adaptation gap. And then there has been also a joint paper with the EPCC. All of the paper has been a great success, and I hope that even if you are working mainly on social security, you will take a chance to give a look to these other papers and see the relation that this important issue about climate change has in different parts of the insurance work. If we move and I give you an overview on what you are going to listen today. So first of all, the climate-related risk, it's clear that they are a challenge at the moment for all the world. And this is the reason because the issue is so important. And actually, half of the global population it's covered by at least one of social protection benefits. So it's really important to link a so big risk to these social security benefits. On the other side, there are many uncertainty on where the climate change is going and which are the related risk which they are going. But on the other side, we also have a lot of uncertainty on where the social security and the social economic models are going to bring us. So in this paper, the implications to the social security system stem from physical and transition risk, and they are analyzed in a really deep way in the paper. So the main thing we are going to speak about today are three main assumption class of risk for social security. And these are demographic, economic, and then the investments. First of all, we are going to speak about social security system. So what do we really mean? Usually we really define which are the social security system we are going to speak in, especially when we make actuarial valuation or when we describe how a social security system is going to work. In this paper, we didn't want to describe or to take in consideration one special or one precise social security system. We thought that when we speak about social security, we speak about a government-run program. And this provides social services and support individuals in different moments of their life. They can be disability, it can be unemployment, it can be retirement. So we were just thinking that if you are dealing with something that remind or recall a social security system, then you have to think about the risks related to climate change, and we tried to rise up the questions that are related. Which are the main risks we are speaking about? It's the financial impacts, the health impacts, the economic impacts, and migration and displacement. So this is what you will hear today. And the next speaker that will bring you through the demographic issues is Michelle. Please, Michelle.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I just wanted to reiterate, it was a lot of fun working with you all and putting together this paper. Personally, I learned a lot. So anyway, let's get on to the content. So before I jump into the demographic assumptions, let's continue on with articulating in a bit more detail what assumptions we'll be focusing on today. So as Barbara mentioned, social security involves long-term projections which relate to financial health and sustainability of a country's social security program. working in this area, it means that we need to consider things like trends in different areas, including demography, the economy, investments, the flow of capital, and the interactions between these trends and assumptions. So from a social security perspective, long-term projections are important for policymakers and administrators to anticipate potential challenges, to develop strategies, and ensure the long-term financial sustainability. By looking at kind of longer term projections, it can help inform things like funding shortfalls, demographic shifts in the working population or in retirement age. And then based on that, it can help governments make informed decisions about adjusting contribution levels, retirement ages, benefits, investment strategies, just as a few examples. So as actuaries, it's important for us then to play a role in informing and communicating these long-term projections to decision makers. And some of the assumptions that we'll cover today include, from the demographic perspective, mortality, morbidity, fertility, and migration, which then informs things like the duration and the quantity of benefits and contributions. From the economic perspective, you have things like inflation and wage growth or unemployment rates, which can help inform things like benefit indexation or contributions. And then from an investments perspective, assumptions could include how capital markets might react, which then inform things relating to financing, particularly for systems that rely on investment income. Obviously, there's a whole host of other assumptions that we can include when making long-term projections. But for today and in our paper, we focus on these key assumptions that we've identified and the interactions between them. Now, this is a climate-focused paper. So from a climate lens, we should also keep in mind that the events and the trends from physical transition risk impacts tend to affect different social groups differently. So we can have a range of positive or negative outcomes, and some which tend to impact more vulnerable parts of society in a more significant way. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and I'll touch on that as well as I continue talking. So if we move on to the next slide, we start with the first aspect of our demographic assumptions. So if we think about kind of overall from demographic perspective, changes in climate-related risks will impact from a physical perspective, so directly and indirectly, either through events or longer-term shifts, and then transition risk impacts. For example, you might think about food shortages or second-order impacts like that. And they have different impacts to human health by age and gender, and also if you consider things like comorbidities or something a bit more complex. As I mentioned earlier, we'll focus today on birth rates, on mortality, morbidity, and migration, go through a few examples, and then also think about two angles. So one, the relevance to making social security projections, and then two, consider the climate lens on top of that and how climate considerations then need to interact or need to be factored into when you're making assumptions. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So this first one gives a bit of an overview on birth rate as a key demographic assumption. If we think about birth rate, it's one of the main determinants of your future population size. And if you think about Social Security, it has implications for the size and the distribution of your future workforce, what you need to do to ensure sustainability, and kind of how that informs level of contributions as well. If we look at take a step back and look at a global perspective, forecasts of the population are expected to peak before 2100 from a various number of sources, which means that we're expecting either fertility to decrease or slow down. And the impacts then on your social security projection would differ depending on the framework. So either if you have something closer to a pay-as-you-go, you'll have different considerations compared to a fully funded system. So if you think about something that's closer to a pay-as-you-go system, then changes in your birth rate will obviously directly impact the adequacy of the system for your current and future working generations. There could be considerations around shifts in the working to non-working ratio, and then a smaller population in the future could give rise to issues around sufficiency of Social Security. So one thing to consider there. An important concept is the old age dependency ratio. So that's the ratio of retirees to workers. As your birth rate falls, this ratio will tend to increase with everything else being equal, and therefore it would make social security financing more difficult under these types of frameworks. If I turn to a fully funded framework, there is a stronger link between contributions and benefits, and therefore there tend to be smaller impacts from changes in birth rate on sustainability. However, it doesn't mean that you can kind of not think about it. There's potential second order impacts there to consider as well, from a broader perspective of what it does for the overall population, what it does from an investment return perspective. If we move on to the next slide, we then delve into the climate drivers of what's impacting the birth rate and what then needs to be considered from a climate perspective. So if we go back to the original kind of opening message, which is overall fertility is falling and we're expecting, populations to peak, there's potential exacerbation of this due to climate-related concerns as well. So as an example, in academic literature, population growth has been cited as one of the factors contributing to growth in greenhouse gases. And some studies have even indicated an awareness of climate and environmental impacts could have an impact on birth rate in terms of making it decrease. So from a direct perspective, we're seeing these impacts come through, but indirectly, we also have potentially just as important second order impacts. So if I think about economic volatility and transition impacts, then that tend to be a bit more practical around the considerations on birth rate and the cost of sustaining a larger population, or the cost of, raising a child or something like that. And so that would have impacts directly on your birth rate assumptions. But then there's also the physical risk, second order impact around health issues that could potentially arise from longer term changes in temperature, for example, or sea level rises impacting where people can live. And again, all of these interactions then get layered on to consider, well, what does it mean for the overall birth rate? And then how does that contribute to the assumptions that I'm making for my longer term projections? That being said, I mentioned sea level rises and places being uninhabitable. This is then closely related to assumptions around migration and those impacts on birth rates. So as you can see, there's lots of interactions and linkages between these assumptions, but we'll touch on migration in a bit more detail later. So if we move on from birth rate, just conscious of time, and we consider mortality and morbidity as our second set of demographic assumptions, these directly impact the duration of financial support at an individual level, and then in aggregate, the pattern of payments that could be made. So some social security systems have even established a clear link between life expectancy, retirement age, which gives us clear motivation to understand the impact of climate-related risks on mortality and inform these assumptions for our projections. On top of this particular linkage, we also need to consider things like the disability income perspective. So research has indicated there are long-term implications for health from climate-related risks, particularly following significant events or disasters. So as we mentioned earlier, or as I mentioned earlier, these impacts tend to vary and differ depending on the population subgroup. So for example, people living with disability may be more impacted by climate-related physical risks because of lower resilience, or people living in different socioeconomic areas may be more impacted by physical risk manifestations of climate-related events. The other perspective then to consider is the event versus long-term change difference, as these impact mortality and morbidity differently. So for example, if I have a wildfire or a flood or a heat wave, this could cause a short-term spike in mortality or hospitalizations, which would show in a long-term projection completely differently to longer-term, slower-moving impacts around general trends in temperature impacting health, for example. And then finally, since we're talking about social security, it's worth mentioning that the distinction between healthy life expectancy, healthy working life expectancy, and overall life expectancy. So I started this kind of saying there are linkages between retirement age and life expectancy. But of course, there's that distinction or that consideration, sorry, to be made between healthy working life expectancy or healthy life expectancy and life expectancy in general. If we look at longer term trends over the like historical period, life expectancy has tended to improve over time. But whether or not that is the same for working life expectancy is unclear and something to consider when making these assumptions. So if we move to the next slide, it's just one moment. I'm trying not to be too croaky. We'll go through a few examples of demographics assumptions from a mortality, morbidity perspective. So this table is incomplete, but it shows a subset of examples and how we can consider these examples. If you refer to our paper, it has a bit more detail in the table. It's not exhaustive, but it kind of provides a framework of how to think about these sources of mortality or morbidity impact. We've broken it down into event-based triggers, longer-term changes, and then second-order impacts. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important to distinguish between events and longer-term trends. And then in the rows, then there's considerations for a pay-go system, and then thinking about it for fully funded systems as well. So this is almost like a framework as how to consider these different impacts coming through from a mortality morbidity perspective. So I'll quickly go through an example. Say you have an event, which is like a wildfire. This could have adverse impacts on mortality and morbidity in the short term and differ by location. And so that's probably one way of considering those event-based triggers. But for longer term impacts, such as temperature increases, as I mentioned earlier, it could have differing impacts depending on socioeconomic factors, age factors. And so different pockets of the population will be impacted differently. And then as a second order impact, you could have potential implications on food shortages from changes in crop yields as a result of climate risk. Again, if you layer these on top of each other, then the interactions between these assumptions would then cause different outcomes from a longer term projection perspective. The consideration then for assumptions around whether we expect the sufficiency or surplus to be impacted in a pay-go framework, or if the level of contributions is sufficient or needs to change for a fully funded framework. The last thing I'll comment on this is that longer term impacts tend to be slower moving, which may come with early warning signs and can be helpful when we're setting assumptions. But it's still just as important to consider those interactions between short and long-term impacts, such as what longer-term impacts could do to migration or vice versa. So speaking of migration, if we move on to the next slide, this is the last piece of demographic assumptions that I'll deep dive into. Shifts in the population from migration will then drive changes in the labor force. So I mentioned this very briefly when we were talking about birth rate, and it leads to changes in the working population. Climate change, as we know, is becoming an increasing driver of migration, and I want to introduce a concept here of climate refugees. So those who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat due to environmental disruption. This number or this statistic has been increasing over time as the physical manifestation of climate risk has been more and more apparent. So such as the surge in global temperatures or the sea level rises might cause some areas of the world to be uninhabitable. In my opening bit, though, we talked about positive and negative impacts, right? So climate change might also make some places better able to sustain larger populations. So, for example, higher temperatures could extend growing seasons or reduce frost risk. And so those are the kind of balancing considerations to think about when making these assumptions. The other consideration here, in addition to your physical impacts, are challenges around adaptation and resilience. So as populations or as groups of people adapt to climate-related risks, we then need to consider how areas or living kind of environments become more resilient to heat, for example, or to wildfires or to floods or cyclones as these become more and more frequent. If we move on, to the next slide, we then consider how international migration impacts the workforce by age and by industry. So typically when people move different countries, the country that people are moving into will have a change in their composition of their labor force, depending on which industry they're moving from, which age groups, and that would then have an impact on your assumptions around social security projections. There will be differing short and medium term impacts versus longer term impacts. As I mentioned, adaptation is a key consideration here, as in the longer term, there could be scope for more substantial adaptation measures and techniques to come in, or sustainable development initiatives on migration as well. The complication here is that it's also difficult in all of these assumptions to attribute reactions to climate-related risks from a social security standpoint. However, it doesn't mean that just because it's difficult to attribute it, that it's not a consideration. It's still important to consider how these assumptions could potentially be impacted. So from a specific to migration, as we're talking about that, then things that we could consider around initiatives on skills and training, impacts for the working tax base, potential changes in the GDP in the long term, and overall shifts in industry and economy, which would then impact the burden on the health system, other government-sponsored support, and broader considerations as well. So I know there was a lot of content, and I covered quite a few examples, but I hope this gives you a bit of a flavor around the types of demographic assumptions that you could consider when making long-term projections and thinking from a social security perspective. I'll hand back to Barbara, I think.
Thank you a lot, Michelle. And the next speaker is Jackie. And please, Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Barbara. So before I start, I just want to echo what Michelle said. I really enjoy working on this paper as well. It was a great learning experience and a lot of fun, like Michelle said. Okay, so I'm going to continue talking about the other sections in the paper on economic impacts from climate change and touch a little bit on the investment return and market effects. So actually, as Michelle and Barbara just mentioned, climate change can have pretty big impacts and may disrupt many areas of our lives. And in general, for social security programs, climate change can have substantial impacts as it can influence a country's economic condition, which can then affect the revenue that are used to fund those social security programs. And at the same time, climate change can also increase the demand for financial supports or services. So this can create a further strain on the social security programs and government finances. So in the following few slides, I will be talking about the economic impact from climate change. And more specifically, we will look at the impact from climate physical risk and climate transition risk separately. So Michelle already touched on this terminologies earlier, and I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with those terminologies. But here on this slide, I included some short descriptions of climate physical risk and transition risk. So basically, physical risks are related to the rising temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, and more extreme weather events. So these can all have long-term macroeconomic effects. And for transition risk, on the other hand, they are related to the disruption that are caused by the transition into a low carbon emission economy, which may then impact the labor market, the value of assets, among other things, and of course, the economic growth in general. Next slides, please. All right, so on this slide and the next one, we're going to look at some of the major economic impact from climate physical risk that were presented in the paper. So the first impact is damage to property and infrastructure. Also, we can call them physical capital. So this also includes damage to inventories, raw materials, extractable natural resources, and etc. So this is straightforward as the frequency and severity of climate related events increase, damage to asset will also worsen and affect the longevity of the physical capital, which may increase the pace at which capital depreciate and increase the cost of those damaged property. And then subsequently, this may result in higher insurance premium and or reduce insurance coverage, which can, of course, have significant implications on the overall economy. At the same time, the current infrastructure might not be built to withstand the harsher climate. So in that case, without any adaptation, climate change may continue to degrade the infrastructure performance. This can threaten our economy as well as a lot of other essential social services. So until now, I mentioned a lot of potential downside risk from this impact, but it's also important to know that climate-related investment may also present new opportunities. So especially in sectors related to climate adaptation and mitigation projects, for example, in clean renewable energies and green infrastructures. So the second impact that's listed on the slides is from climate change. It's on future labor force, productivity, and economic output. So the labor force could be reduced due to increased mortality and morbidity, like Michelle covered earlier on. Similarly, the harsher climate can also affect the working environment, especially for outdoor activities, which can reduce labor productivity, of course. Finally, I guess the resulting economic impacts are potentially going to be felt unevenly across the globe, with the hotter and lower income countries being potentially more affected. Next slide, please. All right. So on this slides, we will look at the monetary implication of climate-related risk. We will discuss a little bit what might be the impact on future inflation. So first of all, I just wanted to mention a new terminology that was first introduced in a speech from the European Central Bank. So for reference, I actually included the link at the bottom of the slides if you want to read about the speech. So there are basically three types of inflation related to climate change. So there's climate-flation, fossil-flation, and greenflation. For this slide, we're going to focus on climate-flation first, as it reflects price changes from climate physical risk. We're going to look at the other two when we look at transition risk, since those two are more related. So basically, climate-related risk are they're likely to affect inflation from both the supply and demand side of shocks. So supply shocks are basically resource shortages due to climate change, as it may reduce agriculture productivity and energy efficiency, therefore rising the prices. Then on the demand side, climate change may reduce household or organizational wealth, as well as consumption. So this would be pulling inflation into the opposite direction. There is still a lot of uncertainty based on the research that we have done around the net directional impact on inflation from climate change. However, that being said, it's still very important for us to be aware of those potential shocks. And finally, there are also some other economic issues that can arise from climate physical risk that were presented in the paper. For the interest of time, I'm just going to mention them very quickly here. So in the paper, we also talked about how climate change can alter both international and internal migration patterns, like Michelle actually mentioned this earlier as well. So this can have important implication on a country's economy. And the last social economic impact is that climate change has actually the potential of increasing inequality, and it has in fact been one of the factors that has increased economic differences among countries in the past. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to look at the economic issues related to climate transition risk. So as presented in the paper, climate transition risks are primarily driven by three factors. So first, it's driven by climate mitigation policies, such as carbon taxes and emission permits. All of them aim to reduce greenhouse gases. But there is a risk that those policies may lead to asset devaluation and financial losses, especially for the more carbon-intensive industries. Then the second factors are technological advancements. So these can increase production costs and reduce market value for sectors that rely on outdated and carbon-intensive infrastructure. And the last one is the shift in public sentiment and consumer preferences, which may damage the reputation of the company that are tied to the more carbon-intensive industry, and this would further impact their financial stabilities. So also then in the paper, we presented two channels through which these transition risks can affect the social security system. So the first channel is through economic and financial factors, such as investment returns, productivity, income levels, which are all essential to the sustainability of the social security system. The second channel is through household welfare. So real wage, employment rate, and consumption, which can all be impacted by climate transition. So since they will be able to affect the adequacy and fairness of the social security system. And to manage those risks, social security programs may need to adjust their contribution and benefit to ensure long-term stability as well as intergenerational fairness. Next slide, please. So here on this slides, I included an excerpt or example of a very useful chart that Ivan, actually, who's the author of this section of the paper. So this chart summarizes what we just looked at on the previous slides pretty well. So please refer to the paper for the full detailed chart. Basically, in a nutshell, the chart shows how the economic and financial effects, which is the first channel that we just talked about, can impact the sustainability of the pay-as-you-go and the funded system, respectively. And similarly, it also shows the how the second channel, which is social effects, can impact both the adequacy and the intergenerational justice of both the pay-as-you-go and the funded system. So it's a very good chart, and so yeah, please take a look if you have time. Next slide, please. All right, so on this slide, we will look at the impact from climate transition risk on the labor market. So in the paper, we mentioned that climate transition risk could further impact income, employment, and consumption, basically globally, especially in developing countries. In response, the concept of a just transition is gaining traction, which emphasizes the needs for policy that balance climate action with labor rights, social inclusiveness, and poverty reduction. So there are, of course, both opportunity and challenges when it comes to climate transition. A well-organized climate transition offers opportunity for creating high-quality jobs, reducing poverty, and promoting social inclusion. However, climate transition may present some challenges. So, for example, the restructuring of primary and energy sector and the limited adaptation of some labor market may marginalize workers in those affected industry. Also, uneven enforcement of climate regulation globally could shift carbon-intensive industry to a less regulated region, and this would lead to job losses in the region that are actually more committed. So in terms of economic impact from climate transition risk, the paper presented them over 3 stages or 3 period of time. So in the short term, there could be job losses or employment due to climate transition. Then, and this initial underemployment or unemployment may slow down progress, but projections suggest that in the medium term, job creation in clean energy industry and related sector can potentially outweigh those losses. And over the long term, projection expect to see overall positive gain in the labor market, especially through innovation and investment in the green industry. Next slide, please. All right, so here we're looking at transition risk on inflation and economic growth. So as mentioned earlier, when we look at the economic impact on inflation from physical risk, there are three types of inflation. And we covered one earlier. And so here, there are two that are related to climate transition risk. So the first one is fossil inflation, which is driven by the reduction of fossil fuel usage. And the second one is greenflation, which is caused by the rising cost of raw material needed for green energy. So these climate-related inflation, as well as climate inflation that we saw earlier, are all very important for social security systems because they can threaten the system by increasing costs and disrupting savings and pensions, of course. While the central banks may have many tools to stabilize inflation and provide short-term relief, persist inflation due to climate shocks may reduce output and limit the effectiveness of those monetary policy. So this is one of the reasons why successful design and implementation of climate policy can be very, very beneficial. So regarding climate transition policies, the paper presented two main approach that are emerging right now. So one of them is the just transition, which I mentioned briefly on the previous slides. So this approach seeks to reduce emission while fostering economic growth and job creation. And then the other approach advocates basically degrowth and argue that slowing down economic growth is necessary to quickly meet carbon reduction targets. And we saw this in some countries that have reduced emission through both renewable energy, and they also decreased their consumption. So this was an overview of the section on climate change impact on economic issues. Next slide, please. All right, so finally, there's also a relatively shorter section on investment return and market effects from climate-related risk in this paper. Please know that this topic is actually discussed more in detail in another paper published by the IAA. Barbara already talked about that paper. So the title of the paper, I'll just mention it quickly, it's Application of Climate-Related Risk Scenario to Asset Portfolio. And also the link of that paper is included in this slides if you're interested. So in this paper we presented today, we focus more on how the public and private pension system can contribute to a greener financial market, as well as opportunity and challenges to achieving both financial and environmental benefits. I will just quickly cover some of the, I guess, the main idea and of that section here. So first of all, the paper mentioned that effective carbon reduction policy should prioritize expanding low carbon emission industries while managing the decline or transformation of the more carbon intensive sectors. And this is because a poorly managed transition may potentially lead to financial instability, and the rapid growth of a green industry might result in financial bubbles. And then the paper mentioned that sustainable investment has been gaining a lot of attention and importance, where many investors now follow ESG and SRI practices. Similarly, institutional investors such as pension funds are also increasingly focused on sustainability due to regulatory shifts and of course climate-related risk. However, for pension funds, even though they might have a critical role in promoting ESG and SRI practices, they may face fiduciary and regulatory constraints, which can make it challenging for them to be able to invest in the longer term innovative project. But that being said, involvement of pension funds in climate transition can be very crucial, and they offer a lot of benefits as it can reduce social protection costs. That includes unemployment benefits and healthcare, and it can also help to stabilize income, reduce unemployment, and mitigate financial risk linked to the decline for the more carbon-intensive industries. So this concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you very much. I'll pass it on to, I guess, Barbara. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Great work. And next speaker is Asya Billing. Please, Asya.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good morning, good afternoon. Basically, I would like to provide some concluding remarks on the paper. First of all, in the context of the climate change, the uncertainty surrounding future demographic, economic, and investment environment and the impacts on social security program is unprecedented. We rarely see such level of uncertainty when we don't have the previous data and we don't really know how the world will evolve. This uncertainty are driven by physical and transition risks as well as by modeling uncertainty. More frequent and severe weather event may lead to economic instability, and this will make actuarial projection harder and more uncertain. In addition to physical risk, transition to a low carbon emission economy could also increase uncertainty, especially for industry related to fossil fuels. The degree to which countries can adapt to climatic changes and the success of the transition are major driver for many economics and demographic assumptions we make as actuaries in our long-term projections. Finally, it is important to note that the existence of the inherent uncertainty around climate science and climate modeling. Even with the large research effort devoted to climate studies, there is still a large degree of uncertainty regarding the exact nature of future climate scenarios. I think it should be understood that it's extremely difficult to model with any degree of accuracy the impact of climate change on society and the economy, since individuals and community affected directly or indirectly by climate shocks behave in rather complex and heterogeneous way. Next slide, please. So we heard that the impact that climate change has impact on our actuarial work and actuarial work for Social Security program. So let me describe a couple of aspects of these impacts. First of all, the actuarial standards and guidelines specify that the projections for Social Security should be based on neutral assumptions, that is, assumptions without any margin for adverse deviation. Further, the projection period might be 75 years or more. So in choosing neutral assumptions over such a long-term period, it is really hard to ignore the potential impact of climate change on demographic and economic assumptions. However, at this point of time, the lack of historical data, changing policies, and extreme uncertainty surrounding transitional pathways and residual physical risks make it difficult or even impossible for actuaries to directly incorporate climate change impact in neutral assumptions. Instead, actuaries may choose to develop reasonable scenarios, incorporating the various ideas that have been presented in this paper and illustrate how these scenarios impact actuarial assumptions and results. I invite you to look at the appendices to this paper for examples of such modeling. Social Security institutions, together with actuaries, are recommended to consider climate-related risks as a part of their risk management analysis. Guideline 34 of ESA-ILO guidelines actuarial input into the understanding of the catastrophic risks explicitly refers to climate change related risks and highlights the importance of Social Security institutions considering actuarial input in understanding these risks and in modeling them. To respond to these guidelines, Social Security actuaries need to develop expertise in climate change related risks, modeling of such risks, and in particular scenario analysis. I would like to refer you to the early papers of the IA climate paper series, which can serve as useful education materials. Finally, as climate change impacts evolve and in view of changing demographic and economic environments, several actions may be required to adapt social security schemes to new realities. This may include amending existing schemes to strengthen protection to the covered populations, introduction of the new schemes covering the climate-related risk where no current protection is offered, analysis of risk to financing and sustainability, for example, from potential erosions of sources of revenues or increased demands for benefits, analysis of risk to adequacy of benefits, for example, fragmented careers due to climate transition, analysis of risk to coverage, for example, coverage of migrants, and many other areas. So social security institutions need to involve actuaries in the discussion on policy and strategy issues related to the climate change. Next slide, please. To conclude, let me reiterate some of the messages that were heard today. First, this paper is an example of close and very successful collaboration of two organizations, IAA and ESA. Our two organizations have a long history of collaboration, which I hope will continue in the future. The second message is that the effect of climate-related risk could be significant on demographic, socioeconomic, and investment-related environment, and as a result can impact social security. At the same time, there is an enormous uncertainty about the magnitude and directions of these impacts. As a result, actuary and social security institutions are encouraged to consider those risks in their work, so social security is ready to protect covered population when the time comes. And finally, to be successful in assessing climate-related risks, actuaries need to collaborate with other professionals such as economists, demographers, and climate change scientists. Let me finish by encouraging you to read this very interesting paper as well as other papers in this climate series of the IAA. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it to Barbara.
Thank you, Asia. And please, you already noticed that questions are coming. Please just post your questions on the Q&A box. We will try to answer to them. But before to move to the question, please just let me thank two more people. So we had two more authors that were not presenting today, but that have been making us, everyone else that was today in this presentation, a really great work. And I'm speaking of Christine Dunnigan. She is actually working in the office of the Superintendent of Financial Institution in Canada, and Ivan Alexis Fonseca Diaz. He is in the Department of Actuarial Science of the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And as everyone has already been saying, it has been a great pleasure to lead this group, and I have been learning so much myself. And yes, it has been also fun, even if we were around the world with a really strange timetable when working. But work has never been so fun. So thank you to all of you, and let's see the question, what we have there. So Asia, I have one question for you. So it's related to your to the last slide, or not the last, the previous one. So you were speaking about the guidelines and the ISEP 2. So the question is how far we are from issuing specific standards on the disclosure of the climate change risk in Social Security actuarial reports, and should there be international standards?
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. Like, we personally, in our work, we were struggling what to do with the climate-related disclosures. In my personal opinion, the standards are needed, but the standards are not extremely prescriptive standards, because, for example, from the point of view of including the climate in the neutral assumptions, I don't think we are ready, because mainly because of the uncertainties that I mentioned. The climate impacts really, like the physical impacts in the future and the impacts on social security program, really depends very much on the climate policies, and climate policies are changing as we speak. Like almost every day we can see new policies coming into effect. So as a result, I think what I would like to see in the standards is probably the encouragement for actuaries to include climate-related scenarios in the actuarial reports. And my understanding that IAA is considering the potential work of such standards. But I think we're still quite far from issuing the standards like that.
Thank you, Asia. We have one other question from Dermot. Thank you, Dermot. How should, I guess that maybe Michelle could answer. So how should actuaries ensure that climate change assumptions are consistent across demographic, economic, and asset area? For example, increased temperatures could reduce mortality rates from cold and so extend life expenses, but could also have other impacts, beneficial or disadvantageous on economics and asset values. So, Michelle, I give you the floor and
Thanks, Barbara. And Dermot, that's a really, really good question, because I think some of the challenges that we have now are thinking about these interactions between the different sets of assumptions and how to reflect them appropriately. And I completely agree with you that consistency is important, because you don't want to be making one set of assumptions on one side with demographics that contradicts something else that you're making on the economic side. I think part of the how would be staying connected from a assumption setting perspective. So not siloing climate considerations separately from everything else, but considering climate as part of your overall assumption setting process, so that holistically, at least, there's a consistent theme there. But obviously it would differ, and the specifics of how would differ depending on the way that your assumptions are set and how you're actually implementing these in your models as well. So it's not really a concrete answer, but hopefully that helps a little bit. I don't know, Barbara, if you've got more to add.
I guess that you just answer. And I maybe I can add only that we had a lot of discussion on this because we were coming from different countries, and so in the north we have actually people dying for the cold, and it's a good thing that maybe it will be no more so cold in the future. But there are many countries where people, it's already now dying for the hot weather. So it's quite difficult to create assumptions that fit all. So this is the reason, because we encourage each actuary or technician working and making assumption and thinking about assumption that they have to fit to their own country and own system.
We have the next question. Are current social security actuarial valuations take climate risk formally into considerations or only indirectly? I probably will direct this question to Jackie, and the kind of sister question is probably she can talk about the scenarios modeling from the appendix to the paper.
Thank you, Asia. So yeah, I guess our current Social Security actuarial evaluation take climate risk formally into consideration. I can answer that, I guess, for our perspective. So here at the OSFI of Chief Actuary, we did take into consideration climate risk formally into our actuarial evaluation. And this was actually done for the previous actuarial evaluation. So that was the 31st actuarial evaluation that we did for the Canada Pension Plan, CPP for short. And you will be able to find more information on the actual report that's public on the website. And also, like Asya mentioned, we included in the appendix of this paper a case study. So that's based on this climate scenario analysis that we did. I guess I can also talk a little bit about that. So for this valuation, we wanted to include climate change in our actual valuation, basically. And it was the first time we did it. And given it was such a kind of new and complex topic, we couldn't cover everything. So what we did is that we wanted to keep the scope more at a high level. And we really focused and only look at the impact on GDP and how that would affect the CPP. So we decided to also only focus on negative impact of GDP. So what we did is that we did a sweep of different literature and research out there and got kind of different assumptions on GDP impact on climate change. And we incorporated that into our actual valuation models. And so we formally included that in our actual valuation. And in the appendix of the paper, you will be able to find the kind of the detail of the analysis as well as the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. The next question is probably for Michelle. Given the demographic impact tend to be longer terms, how concerned should we be when setting assumptions?
Thanks, Asya. So I think this is probably a question that's in the back of people's minds because a lot of these impacts coming through are quite long term. And with climate, there's kind of unknown unknowns out there as well. So we don't know the extent or how to quantify some of these impacts. From an assumption setting perspective, because we are working with long-term projections, it's important then to consider the range or the potential outcomes that could impact your projections and how they feed into these assumptions. So from a how concerned should we be? Yes, we should be concerned, and yes, we should be considering these factors, but also acknowledging that there is a range of uncertainty there to reflect as well. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, Barbara.
Yes, we have one more question. How can we motivate social security management to enforce job creation in low-earning countries with fewer workforce and little and not equivalent investment, yet involving demography?
Oh, this is the $1 million question that probably has much wider implication than climate change. I think in general, social security in some countries has really dual mandate. And one of the examples is that kind of the is the investment of social security funds in the country's economy. This is the practice that arises, like basically creates a lot of debates between the 2 points of view. That one, that the social security fund should be used solely invested solely in the interest of beneficiaries, and another view that the social security fund should be invested to further the job creations and development, economic development of the country. So this is one of the potential roads. Another road that I can see is basically by offering the protection, like offering protection to vulnerable populations, such that this protection can serve a foundation for the job creation in the economy. So I think I will stop here. And once again, like we probably could discuss this question for another hour.
Asya, maybe I can make a further comment and link a bit this question to the paper. There has been, we have had a really interesting discussions on the fact that, of course, the climate change is a bad thing. We can see a lot of bad thing following and from the overwarming of the Earth, and this is clear. On the other side, we have been reading many papers on how investment can impact on the economy of different countries. And believe it or not, in some paper it was written and it was shown that such a policy that rebuild and invest a lot in the economy of the country to avoid the overeating of the earth would be a really good chance to create new workplaces. So it's we are not politicians. We are just people making scenarios and telling what is going to happen. So just keep on it, and really we with all the group we have spoken a lot of the fact that and thinking how to present this issue. Should we present only the good thing or only the bad thing? We try to present everything to you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Indeed, the investment in adaptation and mitigation measures is a great job creator for every society.
Yeah. So I guess that we have been using most of our time, and I thank all of you for joining this webinar. I hope that it was a pleasure also for you, as it was at least for me. And once again, I thank all the drafting group. We still have, let's see what we have. Thank you. So I thank all the drafting group for this wonderful paper. I hope that it will be useful also to all of you. And I would like to give a big hug and a warm thank also to all the IIA staff that in this drafting process has been helping us and making this possible. So thank you and have a nice day, whatever the time is in your country.